It's great to be here, and it's been really interesting to hear about what all you're doing with the Maui fires. So this is a project looking at Indonesia in the aftermath of the Indian Ocean tsunami. That was way back in 2004. This is joint work with many people, including with our collaborating partners in Indonesia who work at a NGO called Survey Meter. So just to remind you a little bit about the event, this event was triggered by a major earthquake, 9.3 on the Richter scale. The epicenter was about 100 miles off the coast of Sumatra, the west coast, but the rift zone ruptured for 1,200 kilometers and sent waves slamming into all 26 countries with coastlines bordering the Indian Ocean. The disaster impacts differed a lot for different countries. Indonesia was the country that was hardest hit, and particularly the province of Aceh, Indonesia, where around 200,000 people were killed. That was about 5% of the province's population, and about 750,000 were displaced. So this is what one of the really hard-hit communities looked like in the aftermath of the waves. And you can see that most of what was on the ground was removed as those waves came ashore. They tended to scour the surface and push material inland. Some trees remain, but roads and bridges are destroyed. So we've used a lot of satellite imagery to try to measure the impact of this disaster across different communities. It's been really helpful. There was much less data available back in 2004, and when we started the project, we did not know which areas were most badly damaged, but satellite imagery has become much more available. So this is an image of a village just before the tsunami on that west coast, very idyllic place, beaches, aquaculture, rice paddies. And this is what it looked like 2 weeks after the disaster in very high resolution imagery. Again, the water removed all of the stuff on the low-lying surfaces. So one of the things about the tsunami was that there was a high degree of local variation and impact. So villages that were quite close to each other experienced the tsunami in very different ways. And that gives you, in some sense, a natural experiment setup where some communities were very badly damaged, other communities were really relatively untouched. A huge amount of aid was forthcoming after the Indian Ocean tsunami. This went to lots of different affected countries. About $7 billion was committed to Aceh over the period from 2005 to 2012. And there was a lot of change in that 5-year period after the disaster. This is that same village in 5 years after the disaster. And so geomorphologically, the sand has actually come back and the beaches have been reestablished. Crops are growing again on the fields, roads and bridges have been rebuilt. Something that did not come back very quickly was aquaculture. There were shrimp farms for aquaculture before the tsunami, and the water as it moved ashore changed the depth of the water in those bays. And so reestablishing aquaculture was much more complicated and more expensive, and some places couldn't do it anymore. But there was a tremendous amount of rebuilding, both sort of in a both in terms of the built environment, but also in terms of the natural environment. And we're going to talk about the consequences of the tsunami, both short and long term. Satellite imagery, we've looked at this for a lot of disasters. Hawaii is down there in the lower right-hand corner. And when you look at satellite imagery across multiple types of natural hazards, some of the changes to the landscape really look remarkably similar, regardless of whether it was driven by water moving across or wind, major winds as part of hurricanes, or fires. And so this removal of the built-in natural environment and what is left behind looking nothing like what was there before. And I think that's one of the really, really painful things for survivors is that loss of visual reminders of what their community was like. So we have been working on this project. It's a longitudinal household survey of individuals, families, and communities before and after the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004. We collaborate with Survey Meter and also with Statistics Indonesia, which is the National Statistics Agency of Indonesia. So our basic design was that we worked with the government to access a survey they had done pre-tsunami in 2004, household survey done all over the country. It's kind of like the current population survey. We got permission from them to access their household rosters from the 2004 survey and then go and try to recontact, find those households, document what happened to individuals. So we focused on 13 districts, sort of like counties. There were about 26,000 individuals in those households before the tsunamis. And we did annual survey waves starting about 5 months after the tsunami. So for 5 years, we went every year. And then we moved to like a 5-year periodicity and interspersed with some subsamples where we collect much more detailed data on biomarkers and cognition. We can't afford to do those on the full sample. We cover everyone in the household, so ages 0 up to 80 plus, and we cover communities that span a real continuum of destruction from really none from the tsunami to the really deep destruction that we saw in those first images. And we've interviewed about 96% of survivors at least once over the course of this panel. We track movers, and so over time, our survey has sort of spread out to new places. So in terms of biology, starting with the second wave, we measured height and weight, waist circumference, blood pressure. We get dried blood spots, and more recently, we've moved into venous blood, HbA1c, and CRP, so that we can look at these more advanced biomarkers using point-of-care tests. We've added cognitive components over time, an adapted mini-mental state exam, RAVENS, progressive matrices tests, word recall, and HCAP, which is a set of modules on cognition developed by the Health and Retirement Survey that picks up different aspects of cognition. We've also been experimenting with olfactory function and getting at memory, olfactory memory, via testing people's first, their ability to smell and recognize scents, and then second, how well they remember what they've smelled. And this is much more free of needing to know words and numbers, and so it has a lot of appeal in a population with relatively low education levels. In terms of the actual household questionnaires, we ask about composition, economic resources. We ask individuals face-to-face about education, migration, work, fertility, and then psychosocial health, so post-traumatic stress reactivity and depression. And then we've moved into sort of loneliness and frailty and sleep, and trying to get at all of these different sort of pathways through which exposure to a major stressor impacts a series of health and cognitive outcomes. So, it's interesting with disasters, thinking about, what your in is. This was one disaster in the sense that there was one tsunami, but our study sites, we're working in we started with 487 different communities. These were the communities that were part of that baseline survey. So it was a geographic sample where they picked villages and then households within those villages. And so there were 487 of them that we were targeting, visiting, and they spanned this this continuum of destruction. One of the things that if you work with economists, you get asked is, well, obviously where people were living was completely selection, and those characteristics that affect where people live also could affect how they were exposed. So, we've conceptualize this as a natural experiment where these waves came ashore in 15 minutes. They were unexpected. People had no time to prepare. It also turns out that a lot of what drives wave height is not conditions onshore, but conditions offshore. So very small variations in the unevenness of the ocean floor can generate big amplifications in wave magnitude. And so that's one of the things that drives height of waves as they move ashore. So I'm going to try very briefly to talk about some of our results over this period. I'll spend a little bit of time on the very short-term effects right after the tsunami, but I'll also talk about the longer-term outcomes that come from our data that we collected 10 and 15 years after the disaster. In most cases, I'll be comparing individuals who, at the time of the tsunami, were living in communities that sustained very heavy damage to individuals from communities that did not sustain tsunami damage. We have some other ways to measure exposure. We have reports of what people actually experienced and report back that happened to them during the event. And we also have measures of post-traumatic stress reactivity, which I think, as Allison said, is kind of it's an exposure in and of itself. So we'll look a little bit at that. So I'm going to start with mortality at the time of the tsunami. This comes from taking the rosters that existed in 2004 before the tsunami, going to look for all of those people on those rosters and figure out if they survived or not. For the undamaged communities in blue, mortality rates, the percent dead, by age looks like what you'd expect, very low levels until you get to the older ages. For heavily damaged communities, on average, 30% of people in these villages were killed in the heavily damaged areas. And that level of mortality varies tremendously by age and sex. So the very young were vulnerable, the very old were vulnerable, and in the prime ages, males had much lower mortality rates than females did. There are a lot of different factors for that, but one of them is they were much more likely to know how to swim. And then physical strength made a big difference in terms of whether you could survive the tsunami waves or not. So that is what mortality looked like, and clearly the levels were quite high. It was a big death toll type of disaster. We are lucky in the United States that we don't have disasters that cause that much death so often. Now we're going to look at, so we were going back, and that was our first thing, is like, let's figure out what survival was like, who died and why. So now we'll turn to survival after the tsunami. So let's assume you survive the tsunami. Now we've got this population exposed to an enormous amount of stress. Well, what does survival look like in the next 10 years, assuming that you made it through the tsunami? And so what we'll look at is percent dead in the community at the time of the tsunami. That would be another way to look at exposure. How does the mortality from the tsunami, that rate on the x-axis, drive the chance of surviving to the next, up to 2005. So 10-year sort of survival rate post-tsunami. Well, what it turns out is that that is a very negative slope. The higher mortality was in your community, the better your chances are of surviving that next 10 years. And so you could think about this in two ways. What are the stressors that people experience, and do those exacerbate your risk? Or is it the case that the people who survived were particularly able to survive the next 10 years? And on average, we see this positive selection effect, that the people who survive the tsunami are able to keep surviving over those next 10 years. So that's basically what that says. The higher the mortality level in the community during the tsunami, the lower the mortality in the decade after the tsunami. We've looked a lot at individual risk factors, so post-traumatic stress, loss of family, things like that. Some of those do have a sort of a scarring effect and raise mortality risks, particularly for individuals who were over 50 at the time of the disaster. So it is not that there is no scarring from those stressful exposures, but on average, it actually works the opposite way. That is partially because this was a high mortality disaster. It would not be the same in other kinds of disasters where mortality is quite low. So let's turn to, I'm going to use the term resilience. I agree that this is not the term to use in the very short term, because I think it sets up this connotation of people, survivors, thinking that is what you expect from them, and I don't think that's the case. But the Tsunami Project has helped us understand this return to something that looks like a rebuilt life in the aftermath of something horrible. So the next thing we'll look at is levels of post-traumatic stress. And so what we see is that levels of post-traumatic stress reactivity are raised, elevated for people from these heavily damaged communities, particularly in 2005, right after the tsunami. They're also elevated in other places, and so, this was a disaster that affected people all over the province, of course. But over time, those levels of post-traumatic stress decline. And that is, what you would expect to some degree. They do not remain elevated on average over that whole period. And by 2008 or so, there are no differences, statistically speaking, between those from the heavily damaged communities and those from the undamaged communities. So you could also look at socioeconomic status. An enormous amount of property was damaged as those waves came ashore, and people lost their housing and they lost their livelihoods. And so we ask a question, there are different ways to measure economic resources. One of the questions that I like is a question about where people perceive themselves to be on a ladder of SES. And I like it because you can ask it to everyone, regardless if they themselves have an income or are working or have their own assets. It's just a perception about where you feel like you rank. And so we ask people at each tsunami wave post-tsunami wave to tell us where they rank and also where they thought they had ranked before the tsunami. And what we see in that is that there is a big downturn for those from heavily damaged communities right after the tsunami, but pretty quickly it starts to bounce back up. It doesn't, the red line does not ever overtake the blue line in terms of the undamaged communities. But again, there is this return to feeling that you've regained some of the things that you lost as a function of the tsunami. We looked at various indicators of health. I'm going to say a little bit about child health first. So being in utero at the time of the tsunami, of course, is going to be potentially a big risk factor. We measured children's height for age in the second post-tsunami wave when they were about 2 for those in utero cohorts, and then we can look at how they compare to their older cohorts who were born several years before the tsunami in terms of height for age z-scores. So what we see in that is that at 2 years after the tsunami, there was a large height for age deficit, particularly for those children who were in utero and in the second trimester of pregnancy. So that's 2 years after the tsunami. So over time, those deficits are slowly made up. And in fact, by 2009, 4 years after the tsunami, those kids who were in utero are actually doing better than their older peers who were born before the tsunami. So there was this catch-up and more than catch-up growth for the kids who were in utero. One of the questions that we will ask is, as we have data way out 20 years after the tsunami, is whether that rapid catch-up growth results in more higher BMIs, more adiposity as they hit sort of young adulthood. We've started to look at that, and we actually see dramatically high levels of blood pressure, which is pretty disturbing. So over time, these kids in these first 5 years did recover, and by 4 years out, the kids in utero were doing better than their peers. There is one exception to that, and we do not see recovery for the babies who were born to mothers who report very high levels of post-traumatic stress in the aftermath. And so being in utero, so the tsunami was stressful, right? But not everyone responds to it with the same reaction in terms of PTSR symptoms. And so the group for which we do not see recovery in height for age for these kids is the group whose moms reported high levels of PTSR when we were interviewing them 1 and 2 years after the disaster. Okay, so this was the result that when we got it, I was really fundamentally surprised by, because I would not have expected this. And that is that after the tsunami, we get this reversal of fertility patterns and, in fact, a fertility boom in the highest mortality communities. So before the tsunami, fertility rates, these are age-specific fertility rates and total fertility rates, were higher in the communities that were undamaged than in the damaged communities. 5 years after, in the 3-year period after the tsunami, those fertility rates have switched places. And so there was a big rise in fertility in the communities that were badly affected by tsunami mortality, but it actually fell elsewhere. And some of that effect was driven by couples who lost a child during the tsunami having another child, so sort of replacing a child who had died during the tsunami. But we also see young women who were childless at the time of the tsunami entering marriage more quickly and having a baby more quickly than in other communities. So there was, sort of a desire to rebuild through repopulation as well as to rebuild through return of livelihoods and things like that. So there was an enormous amount of assistance flowing into Aceh, and the silver lining of the tsunami was that it ended a long-running civil war. It was pretty clear that that money was not going to show up and be spent if people kept kidnapping and shooting one another. And so a peace deal was put in place between the Acehnese, who had wanted independence from Indonesia, and the Indonesian government. That stuck. That was a silver lining in some sense, and it generated an enormous flow of resources into the tsunami. And a lot of that went into rebuilding homes and infrastructure, and also support via money in those first 2 years or so after the tsunami. So gradually, there was a restoration to places that look normal. We saw this landscape at the beginning. 9 months after the tsunami, things haven't changed very much, but there's starting to be a little bit more vegetation on the land. 5 years after the tsunami, in community after community, assistance homes have been rebuilt on those land. 140,000 homes were built in 5 years or so. So it was a really impressive ramp up to putting houses back on property and getting people back onto the land where they wanted to live. So our respondents, about 21% of them received an assistance home, and it was up to 80% for those whose homes were destroyed in the disaster. Receipt was actually less likely among those with more resources before the disaster, and the government built only small homes. They were very standardized, and so they were improvements in the kind of housing for some people, but not improvements for others. And I think that was part of the reason that there was not this kind of elite capture of those housing resources. We've looked at what changes with mental health among those who received a home, and we find just among those who got a home that there's a statistically significant decline in these symptoms of post-traumatic stress after receiving that home. So, and that effect is concentrated among those whose homes were destroyed. So I think there's a really important lesson in the importance of trying to deal with displacement and with that incredibly stressful process of moving so many times right after a disaster and getting people back into stable housing. We've looked some at the sort of short and 5-year health outcomes. We've also looked at longer-term health outcomes, and one of the things we see consistently there is that high levels of post-traumatic stress for 2 years are consistently associated with negative health outcomes. For men over 50, those with the high levels of PTSR in 2 years after the disaster have 9 percentage points higher risk of dying in the 10 years after the event. So PTSR raises mortality risks for men. For women, we looked at levels of cortisol in hair 15 years after the event, and what we see there is that for women who's in the damaged communities with elevated PTSR, they have cortisol patterns that are consistent with burnout of that HPA axis system and so dysregulation of the HPA axis. We also looked at C-reactive protein, a measure of inflammation. That is substantially higher among those from heavily damaged areas within 2 years of the tsunami, and 10 to 12% of individuals stay consistently above the cutoff for high risk of CVD. The gap between the exposed and the unexposed declines over time, but those effects persist for 13 years after the tsunami. Parallel results for waist circumference, higher waist circumference. So stressful exposures affect two dimensions of health known to be associated with stroke and CVD. So as we continue to study this group, that's one of the things that we're looking for is how these stressful exposures play out in the long term in terms of cardiovascular disease risks and other kinds of health outcomes. So to add with a few concluding thoughts, baseline data and a comparison group have been really important for this research. Going back to look for a representative set of people who we knew were in place in these communities before the disaster, and then being able to compare those to individuals from communities that were not heavily damaged. There was incredibly devastating destruction and many, many different impacts in the first 5 years. On average, I would say that people worked incredibly hard and found ways to put their lives back together. And to me, that is a message of hope for recovery in the aftermath of major disasters. There was determination on the part of individuals, but also this significant inflow of assistance that mattered as well, and housing is key. This is what Banda Aceh, the capital, where a third of the population died in the tsunami 10 years later, and so really kind of an amazing rebuilding. But there are long-term health and cognitive impacts. Those will continue to evolve, and high PTSR in the first 2 years raises risks for multiple poor outcomes. So to the extent that people can get in with psychological first aid and that is effective, I think that's tremendously important. We have a lot of different collaborators from Indonesia and other places, and we acknowledge with gratitude our NIH funding and other sources.